First off, I want to say thank you guys so much for the overwhelming positive response I had to my last epic shootout. If you haven't seen it, I'll put the links up here so you can check it out. But I was just blown away by the number of people who commented, who liked, the new subscribers that I had, and I want to say thank you very much. I really, truly appreciate it, and I wanted to recognize you guys. Let's get into the shootout. The Nikon D5200 features a 24 megapixel sensor. It has 39 focusing squares, 9 of which are cross-type. It shoots at 5 frames per second, and it also has a wonderful articulating monitor that's going to allow you to view what you're shooting from different angles. It has a built-in flash. Exclusive to the D5200, we have an autofocus assist lamp and a built-in intervalometer, which will allow you to program the camera to take images at different intervals. For $700 at the time of this recording, you are going to be hard-pressed to find a better bang-for-your-buck camera. I think when the Canon T5i was first announced, there were a lot of people who were disappointed simply because it's a repackaging of the previous year's Canon T4i. There have been some very minor upgrades in the grip, in the mode dial, a few other really minor things. It's essentially the same camera. Another thing is the 18 megapixel sensor in the T5i. That design has been around for a while, years in fact, and we've seen it in several other Canon cameras. So yeah, I do think some Canon, supporters were a little disappointed. They wanted to see a little bit more in the Rebel lineup. The Canon T5i only has 9 focusing squares. However, they are all cross-type. It also shoots at 5 frames per second, and it too has an articulating monitor. Now, unique to the T5i when you compare it to the D5200 is that the monitor is touch sensitive. What this means is that it's very easy to navigate the menus, to change the camera settings, to inspect your images. It's a lot of fun to use if you haven't tried it. The built-in flash on the T5i also has a wireless transmitter for off-camera flash work. It too is priced, at the time of this recording, about $700. Now, I've been shooting with both cameras since their release. I know them very well. I have shot thousands of images on both cameras. In fact, I have produced training videos on both cameras, and so if you're a pure beginner and you own either one of them, I can save you a lot of time and frustration in learning your new gear and getting you to taking great images in no time. The epic shootouts are intended to be completely unbiased and informative. I'm not trying to persuade you to buy one camera or the other. I'm trying to give you the information that you need to feel good about the decision that you make. I think probably the ultimate compliment that I get on these videos is when people, make comments and they say, "You've helped me to decide to purchase this camera." If I've done that, then I've done my part. I own both systems, lenses and flash units. I have a lot of money tied up into both of them. There's no benefit to me to, have favoritism here. And so I'm trying to provide data and information and results that you can actually see. I try to do the best job that I can. I'm not trying to offend anybody, and if I do, I apologize in advance. The first tests I would like to get to are the focusing systems. For sports shooting, I like to look at the low light focusing, and I also like to look at live view tracking. The 3 servo tests I wanted to perform were: number 1, side-to-side tracking with the sun behind the shooter. Number 2, I wanted to see how the cameras performed when the subject was moving towards the camera when shooting with his or her back to the sun. Number 3, a subject moving away from the shooter and also shooting into the sun. The plan was to shoot on the servo mode of each camera, which is a predictive focus. I would use the furthest left or right focus squares, shoot on JPEG, shoot on the high-speed continuous burst, and then I would count the shots that were out of focus and find a percentage based on that total. For side-to-side action, the T5i scored a very high 98%, with the D5200 scoring 73%. For action moving towards the photographer, with the sun to my back, the T5i scored a 97%, and the D5200 a 61%. For action moving away into backlight, the T5i scored an 84% and the D5200 a 60%. From my initial tests, it seems that the T5i has an advantage here because its outer focusing squares are cross-type where the D5200s are not. When looking at the images of the D5200, it seems that it struggles not so much with motion, but at the point of acceleration and deceleration, or when the speed of a subject is changing. Once the subject's speed was consistent, the D5200 performed much better. So the question now becomes, how does the D5200 do when using its central cross-type focusing square for sports shooting? And so I decided to repeat situation number 3 using that square. The D5200 showed a much higher 77%. And what this tells me is that the focusing type, whether it's cross-type or not, it does seem to make a significant difference when you're shooting sports. Many of you are probably also wondering, how did the T5i central focusing square perform in the same situation? So I checked it out. And the T5i center square shot at 90% accuracy. It was actually improved. How in the world is it possible that the T5i's center focusing square performs better than its outer squares? Well, one thing that might explain it is that the T5i's center square is a super cross-type square, meaning that it is extra sensitive in the diagonal orientations as well when using lenses with a maximum aperture of 2.8 or wider. What this means is that T5i users won't enjoy this extra sensitivity when using something like a kit lens. But if you're shooting with a 24 to 70 2.8 or a 70 to 200 2.8 or any lens that opens wider, that center focusing point becomes extra sensitive and you can expect increased accuracy. Now please keep in mind this is not a scientific test. A lot of this is subjective in terms of what I believe is in focus and what isn't. I'm starting to become a believer that it isn't so much the number of focusing squares that are important. It is how accurate each of those squares are, as well as where they are placed in the viewfinder. The D5200 does have 9 cross-type squares, but the fact that they're all clustered in the middle is not a strength for sports shooting. I also performed burst mode tests for both cameras, which are rated at 5 frames per second. The burst test measures a camera's speed and endurance in taking multiple images before it starts to slow down its frames per second because it cannot write the image fast enough. Let's listen in. So we're going to take a look at the JPEG burst, and then we're going to take a look at the raw burst. And so Jen's going to stop at the end, and I'm just going to let the camera run out of buffer. You ready, Jen?
Yep.
Go. Starting to slow down. It almost looks like it can go indefinitely. There it comes. It's starting to slow down a little bit. Pretty good. Go, ready, go. Similar thing. It slows down near the end, and then it's getting about 2 or 3 per second. So one comment we had was if we could do raw burst only, and I think that actually makes more sense than doing raw in JPEG, simply because if you are shooting raw, you're going to want to squeeze as much as you can out of it. So I'm going to go into the menu systems here on the Nikon and change this over to raw only so we can do some tests with just the burst rate. Ready? Go. Maybe 2 a second once it fills up. Pretty good. The raw is going to slow down that frames per second. I think I heard about 5 to 7 shots before it started slowing down. I'm ready when you are, Jen. And it slows down. For the burst test, it sounds to me that the D5200 has the edge in that it can record more images before it starts to slow down. Based on these results, if I had to choose only one of these cameras to go shoot a sporting event, I personally would choose the Canon T5i. My low light focusing tests measure a camera's ability to focus in poorly lit conditions. The methodology is posted on my blog as well as shown on my D600 versus Canon 6D epic shootout. For the sake of time, however, suffice it to say that I use the center focusing square on each camera and I go back and forth 30 times focusing between two targets in different lighting conditions. Each are measured with a light meter. One is brightly lit, one is darkly lit. Neither camera was able to consistently achieve focus lock in an environment of negative 0.5 exposure values, so I tested the cameras at 0.6 exposure values. Repeating the test several times, I averaged out the scores and I learned that the Canon T5i averages about 50 seconds, with the D5200 averaging 36 seconds. Now another important note is that the D5200 comes with a built-in focusing lamp that turns on and allows you to focus in very dark conditions, and I decided to test that as well on a close target, negative 1.8 exposure values, and it still finished in 50 seconds. Based on these results, if I had to choose one of these cameras for low light shooting, I personally would select the Nikon D5200. I tested both cameras' ability to focus while in live view, as well as track moving subjects. In terms of tracking a model or an object, both cameras performed very similarly. They did better when the subject filled more of the frame. When the subject gets far away from the frame and we're dealing with smaller amounts of pixels to track, both cameras struggled. And when we look at the final footage for either one of them, you can see it's very jumpy and jittery back and forth. So in terms of the tracking, very similar. In terms of selecting the focus point, it was much easier and much quicker to do on the T5i simply because it has a touchscreen monitor. My ISO tests focus on high ISO noise for JPEGs as well as video files. The reason I focus on these two file types is I'm mainly interested in how well the processors are cleaning up high ISO noise. If you were to look at a RAW file with high ISO from either camera and strip it of any processing, you will almost always see that it is unusable. And there's a lot of variation in terms of, the software available, the skill of the person using that software. RAW files are tremendous. They are great to use, especially if you're doing professional work, but I'm really interested in how the processors are cleaning up that noise before turning it into a JPEG or a movie file, because that is how most casual users are shooting with the cameras. Now, if we look at this color chart when zoomed in at 100%, we can see that the lower ISOs, the colors, the noise are very comparable. As we move into higher ISOs, we see that both cameras start to exhibit some grain, but for the most part, the amount is similar, and I'll just let you guys be your own judges here and decide which one you like more. I also like to do an ISO test for portraits. So I had my model Jen sit in a batter's cage down at the ballpark. Now you're going to notice some other interesting things going on. For example, the auto white balance performance is different between these two cameras. Some people are going to prefer the auto white balance on the left. Others are going to prefer the auto white balance on the right. I personally like the one on the right a little bit more. It seemed more natural, and we're not getting this strange orange reflection on Jen's face from her shirt. As we increase the ISO, we start to see some interesting differences once we get around 6400. And if we're to zoom in and to compare both sides, you can see that the image on the left is starting to show some noticeable grain. It's not much, but it's enough for me to say that for high ISO portraits in shade, the camera on the right has a very slight advantage. When we look at video, it's a different story, and something that I look for is the amount of grain dancing in the midtones of the candles. Again, very comparable. However, in this case, I honestly believe the camera on the left has a very slight advantage. And the deal breaker for me on video was when I looked at the color charts at very high ISOs. Look at the number of swatches that have dancing pixels that is very noticeable in this first example. This is the camera on the right. And if we were to compare it with the camera on the left, it is much more subtle. We get a little flickering, but I think the video performance is much better for high ISOs for the camera on the left. So in conclusion, for the high ISO noise tests, I thought both cameras were very comparable for lower ISOs. Once we got over ISOs of 6400 or greater, I thought the Canon T5i had a very slight advantage for stills. I thought the D5200 performed better for video. Keep in mind, remember that the D5200 is doing this with 24 megapixels instead of 18. Moire is a strange blotchy pattern you're going to see when you video record repeating patterns, such as this great shirt that I have that has very fine horizontal lines. Can you see the strange pattern on the left versus the one on the right? The camera on the right seems to have better Moire performance, and something videographers do is they change the settings of their picture styles, turning their sharpness and their contrast down to reduce this. And as you can see, the camera on the right looks even better when I do this, and the one on the left is still struggling. Not only that, but if you turn these settings all the way down and then add sharpening in post, most of the Moire comes back anyway, so it's kind of a wash. If I had to choose a camera for its Moire video performance, I would have to grab the Nikon D5200. I also shot a lot of video from different parts of the island, including waves crashing, harsh sunlight, sunsets, very dynamic lighting conditions, and I learned something else that was very interesting. The Nikon has significantly better dynamic range. And so what happens is when I'm shooting, let's say, rocks on the beach, is I get this tremendous amount of detail in the shadows on the Nikon that I'm not getting on the Canon. So the truth of the matter is that even when you have both cameras on the same exact exposure settings, it's very typical for them to not look the same simply because you have this greater dynamic range performance on the D5200. So if you're looking for dynamic range, whether it's for stills or video, again, you're going to have to go with the Nikon D5200. Both cameras have a built-in HDR feature for still photos, and this allows them to generate images with details from both very, very bright highlights and very dark shades and tones. While it wasn't perfect, the D5200 performed awesome. I thought its final images looked better, the process occurred faster, it was more consistent. The T5i's HDR seemed off the mark. It seemed to be overexposing, and while the HDR features in other Canon cameras are very, very good, the T5i's was almost unusable. For the HDR feature win, I have to give it to the Nikon D5200. For the portrait test, we're going to play a little game. Grab a piece of paper and a pen and list it 1 through 12, and for each set of images, pick the one you like more on first glance and write it down, whether either it's the right or the left next to the number of that image set. All of the images shown here are straight out of the camera. I've intentionally left off which one is which to remove your personal bias, because if I tell you this one's a Canon and this one's a Nikon, and you have a preference, you're immediately going to gravitate towards the one or the other. This way, you're judging the image solely based on its quality. And in most cases, the casual shooter will not always be able to tell the difference between the two. In often cases, advanced shooters are surprised when they learn they actually liked the opposite brand that they're used to shooting. It's important to note here that each set of these images were taken with the same exact exposure settings, with the same picture styles. I used auto white balance on both, and I also used the same respective lenses. You're going to notice that despite this, some of the images are obviously different. I tried to shoot in many lighting conditions, from direct sunlight to even shade, heavy backlight, mixed lighting conditions, just to show you some good variety. A lot of this is preference. For example, if you walk into a Best Buy and look at all the TVs, you may favor one color representation on one monitor and your friend may prefer the other. And so this really comes down to personal opinion. Okay, so you guys ready for the answers? I'm going to list them here, and you can pause the video and check your answers and see which image do you like more. Do you like Canon more, or do you like Nikon more? And I hope this teaches an important point, is that ultimately the skill set of the photographer is much more important than the camera itself. If I was to give a pure beginner, say a 1DX or a D800, they're still going to struggle. If we give a T5i or a D5200 to anybody who has good skill sets, they can expect to see some solid results. Now, as an example, I took both of these high key images without any flash. It's just under an overhang with strong backlight. I tuned them up in Photoshop, and the final image is dramatically better, at least I think. If you want to learn these little tricks that I use, I have excellent courses on advanced techniques, lighting, and even Photoshop for pure beginners. When we're talking about operational efficiencies, that essentially refers to the number of steps it takes to change a function or to change a setting, and this is going to make a huge difference over the life of the camera. Now on the T5i, we have a rolling primary controller, which changes our shutter speed. We have an aperture button that if we hold down and also rotate that wheel, the aperture changes. We have a dedicated ISO button, which would allow us to change our ISO. And for the most part, those features are very similar on both cameras, pretty straightforward, pretty much the same thing. The difference in the T5i is that we have this awesome touchscreen monitor. Now, if you haven't actually used a touchscreen monitor, I would definitely recommend trying it because it really speeds things up. We can press our Q button, and then we have access to things like white balance. We can double tap it, come in here, double tap the item we want, and we're back out. So you can see it's very quick, very easy to change your secondary settings. Our drives, for example, super quick. Now the touchscreen is also going to be great when you review images. If I press the play button, you see we have this gorgeous sunset. Yeah, and by the way, the T5i takes great pictures. You know, I know I've mentioned a little bit about the dynamic range, but you can see I'm just scrolling through the images here, and you can see these are really nice. The touchscreen essentially works like a smartphone. So if you pinch in, you can scroll through many images at once. It is a lot of fun. It's super nice. It's very quick, very easy, a lot of fun to use. The most important difference about the two cameras when we're talking about live view is how the exposure preview works and how the controls work when we're in live view. So to go to live view, push the live view button. And so I'm sitting in my backyard. We have this tree, the sun behind it. And the great thing about this is I can change my shutter speed. I can change my aperture, no problem. I can also touch the monitor and drag these sliders around. It's really nice. The exposure preview works whether you're in the photography mode or whether you're in the video mode. You still have an exposure preview for any of the three exposure controls. Now another thing that's really nice about this is if we're focusing for stills, we just touch on the monitor and it's going to focus right on that point. Really nice. If we go into the menu systems, which have all these different tabs, we just touch the tab we want. So you can see that the speed and the ease of operating the T5i is very quick. It's an enjoyable, fun shooting experience. The D5200 is very similar in that we have a primary control. It's in the back of the camera. You use your thumb, changes our shutter speed. There's an aperture button that you push and hold down to change our aperture. If we wanted to change our ISO, we would push a button on the front of the camera called the FN button, and we could rotate that and change our ISO. And this is where we start seeing differences. For example, changing the secondary settings. If the camera shuts off, which it usually does every 4 to 8 seconds, you have to push the I button to open up the menu, push it again to navigate the menu, and then we would have to scroll over using the directional pad, select the item we want, go into the menu, select it. So you can see that the number of button presses to do the same things on the D5200, it's going to take more buttons, more navigation. And other things are even less intuitive. For example, if we wanted to change the release modes, we would have to come in here, know that it's in the green tab, scroll down to the release modes, and change it. Once you know the camera and you know where everything is, it's not as big as a deal. If you're a pure beginner, it's going to be a little bit more frustrating. It's going to take a little bit more time to learn and to navigate. Image review, you're just going to push the play button, and then you could scroll through one at a time pretty much. Now we start seeing some problems when we get into live view. Some people don't think it's a big deal. I think if you're a videographer, you're doing lots of camera setups and you're changing your exposure settings a lot, this is going to come back over and over throughout the life of the camera. You'll notice that we can still change the shutter speed. Let's get this down to 60. We can also change the aperture. I'm pushing and holding the aperture button. I can also change the ISO. But something that you should be noticing is there is no exposure preview change. It is the same look no matter what shutter speed I have. Okay, so if I was to take a picture on this setting, play it back, it's completely underexposed. Okay, so well, what would we do? We'd change the setting again, take a picture, maybe we'll get lucky. Nope, still underexposed. And so you have to leave live view. Let's leave live view. Come out to our information screen. Okay, we have our exposure compensation bracket. We can use, let's use a smaller or a wider aperture. And we'll let more light in. Okay, and then we can see, okay, now it's lined up. And we can go back into live view. We can take a picture. And it should be ballpark, okay, essentially. That's one way you can do it. Now there is a way to change this so we can get exposure preview while we're in live view. The way you do it is you're going to push your menu button. We are going to go into our shooting menu, come down to movie settings. We're going to turn on our manual movie settings to on. And what this is going to allow us to do is to get an exposure preview. Okay, so now when I change the shutter speed, we can see that we do get exposure change. I can also change my ISO and it still gives an exposure preview. Awesome. The problem here is that when I try to change my aperture, nothing happens. So in order to change the aperture, we would have to exit live view, push the information button. I'm going to push and hold down my aperture button, rotate my selector wheel. I can change my aperture. Then I can go back into live view and I can make adjustments with, let's say, the ISO. Bump the ISO up and get the look I'm going for. So with live view on the D5200, you have to pick and choose whether you want exposure preview without changing your aperture, or if you want to be able to change your aperture without having exposure preview. I recommend having exposure preview and exiting, changing the aperture, because when you're doing lots of setups, you need to see what you're doing. So in summary, on the operational efficiencies, the touchscreen monitor for the T5i, it's going to make it much quicker, much easier to change your settings. And you also have the benefit of the exposure preview while you're in live view and still able to change all your settings where we don't have that on the D5200. Raw banding is essentially a horizontal type of artifact we see in RAW files in post-processing when we're adding 3 or 4 exposure values. It's very common with all DSLR cameras to see some kind of raw banding. I tested both cameras at an ISO of 400 as well as 6400, and something that I noticed is that at lower ISOs, the D5200 showed very distinct, very fine raw banding patterns, whereas the banding pattern in the T5i was a little bit more diffuse. At an ISO of 6400, we see wider banding on the D5200 and it becomes a lot more noticeable. And again, on the T5i, it is more diffuse. This is something that was a little bit surprising to me simply because the D5200 has an excellent sensor and I expected its banding performance to do better, but this wasn't the case. If I had to choose one of these two cameras for its raw banding performance, I would take the Canon T5i. Something I noticed when I shot the color charts was that when both cameras were set up on a tripod with the same exact exposure settings, shooting at the highest resolution of JPEG quality, was that the Nikon images were about twice the file size as the Canons. For most of you, this isn't going to make a difference, but if you shoot events such as sports, maybe parties, weddings, receptions, things of that nature where you might have extensive workflow after the shoot, it's just something you should be aware of. You may want to play with your compression settings on the camera, and that might really help. So in conclusion, which camera would I recommend to what kind of shooter? It's a tough one because we saw in this epic shootout that in some of the tests, one camera was the clear winner, and in many of the other tests, they were very similar. I think when we're looking at resolution, dynamic range, total image quality, the Nikon D5200 is the winner. It produces beautiful images, and I truly hope that I've demonstrated that. I love Nikon sensors. The more I shoot with them, the more I think they are spectacular. When I was shooting sunsets, I found myself time and again grabbing the Nikon D5200 for the HDR feature, for the general dynamic range and the raw files. It's a wonderful, beautiful camera. Bang for your buck. It's going to be very hard to beat. Now, if you are primarily a sports shooter, if you have small children who run around like little gremlins, if you are a pure beginner or you're not sure how serious you're going to get into photography, my recommendation would be the Canon T5i. Now, that might throw some of you off because I just said overall image quality D5200, but I learned a very important lesson doing this epic shootout, is that beyond a camera's functions and features, there is an emotional, personal shooting experience that a person has with the camera. And that experience is going to be very different depending on the person as well as the equipment they're using. The touchscreen monitor on the T5i makes it a very intuitive, very fun, and very enjoyable shooting experience. Now, the reason why I share that is because I can't tell you how many times I've heard of beginning photographers who just get their camera, they try it out, they feel frustrated because they're not getting great results, and they put the camera on a shelf and they don't use it. And I never want that to happen. I want all beginning photographers to have a really great shooting experience. And so when I had a friend come to me and ask, she said, which camera should I get? I said, what kind of shooting are you doing? She says, I don't really know, but I'd like to learn. I said, okay, yeah, you're gonna want to go with the T5i because you're going to learn photography faster with it. And the D5200, it's great once you get a hang for the camera, once you know how it operates and you're familiar with the menus and the features. It's going to take a little bit more time to feel really comfortable with it. In any event, that is my epic shootout and my recommendations for the Nikon D5200 against the Canon T5i. I hope you found it unbiased and informative, and I hope it helps you make a great decision if you're looking to buy one of these two cameras. If you haven't subscribed, please do so now because it really helps me to see which videos are more interesting for my viewers. And I definitely want you guys to know, each and every single one of you, yes, you, that right there, the person who never comments, I want to say thank you because I see your views and I do appreciate it. It means so much to me, and I'm going to continue to try to make the best videos I can to make them informative and to contribute to the photography community. In any event, good luck with your shooting. I'll see you next time. If you found this video helpful, you may be interested in my Canon T5i or my Nikon D5200 crash course. I'll show you how to use your camera and shoot like a pro in no time. You can order it from the following link.